Today we are talking about the Nyköping Banquet, the episode when Swedish medieval society traveled in time and copied a plot from Game of Thrones. But before we go back to medieval times, we will first make a stop in 19th century Sweden. One day a young boy is out swimming in the river Nyköpingsån outside of Nyköping Castle. Suddenly he finds a large key in the river. The key is sold, and eventually through the ownership of Count Erik von Rosén, it ends up in Sörmland's museum, who has published these pictures of it. So just keep this key in mind as we move on with our story. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Sweden is legally not a hereditary monarchy, but an elective one. In this period, this in practice has meant that the House of Erik from Västergötland province and the House of Sverker from Östergötland province has competed for the throne and basically taking turns holding it. A quick look at the dynastic affiliation of the kings at the time gives us a pretty good idea that it was changing times. Change that rarely came peacefully. In the middle of this competition was the House of Bjelbo, who traditionally held the title of Jarl, especially under the regnal periods of the House of Erik. The position of Jarl being the second highest position in the country at the time. If you have ever read the books about the fictional character on the Knight Templar or seen the film series, you will have a basic understanding of this time period. If not, I will have a link for the trailer in the description. The books, although fictional and not perfect in their historical accuracy, are in my opinion a fantastic first view into Swedish medieval society. But let's move on with our story. This period in Swedish history ends in 1250 with the last king of the House of Erik dying without a clear successor. Jarl at the time was the king's brother-in-law, Birger of the House of Bjelbo. Birger Jarl is a powerful and ambitious man who has a son with his wife, the king's sister. Birger now puts his young son on the throne and takes power for himself as regent. This more or less immediately sparked a rebellion led by powerful families known to history as Folkungar, from mainly the northern Svealand province. The two sides met at the 1251 Battle of Haraldsbro. And here I will quote history professor Dick Harrison's book, Sveriges Medeltid, about Sweden during the Middle Ages. Harrison writes about what happened. According to the Erik Chronicle, Birger Jarl, supported by Bishop Kohl in Strängnäs, achieved victory through deceit. The bishop is said to have declared a truce, after which the Folkungar laid down their weapons and crossed the river. They were then treacherously seized by the Jarl, who had them executed by beheading and confiscated their properties. The Erik Chronicle is highly critical of the Jarl's actions, explicitly stating that the Folkungar were subjected to excessive violence and were treated unjustly. After the settlement at Haraldsbro, the political climate in Sweden was marked by calm. The opposition was eradicated, and the Folkungar had lost their economic basis. Before new unrest could arise, a new generation of vengeful noblemen would have to come of age. Through the abuses at Haraldsbro, Birger Jarl brought over 2 decades of peace. He did not hesitate to exploit his newly gained power to the fullest. In one stroke, Birger Jarl had set the course for a period of national consolidation under the House of Bjelbo. Harrison explains the fundamental shift that now occurred. The extraordinary position of power that Birger Jarl achieved in the 1250s and 1260s was not only translated into development of a tax system, the establishment of towns and castles, and alliances with German merchants and neighboring kings. What has especially cemented the Jarl's legacy in Swedish history is his legislative work. From this point on, the Swedish central authority had a clear ambition to build a rule of law society, with a royal monopoly on violence, something that had not been possible before due to the lack of military capacity to enforce such authority. This, though, did not end the violent period. Instead, it moved it from being a Game of Thrones among houses to an intra-family affair. When Birger Jarl died in 1266, his sons more or less immediately started fighting for power, leading to the eldest son, King Valdemar, being ousted from power after his loss at the Battle of Hova. The victor in the battle, and the new king, was his brother Magnus, who has since gotten the nickname Barnlock for his continued work on consolidating royal power and making laws that weakened the powerful families of the realm. When Magnus died in 1290, he left 3 sons, Birger, Erik and Valdemar, all minors at the time. His eldest son Birger was just 10 years old, and a regency under the powerful Lord High Constable of the realm, Torkel Knutsson, commenced. But the brothers, having grown up on stories about their fathers' and uncles' squabbles and how their grandfather had won power, immediately started fighting amongst themselves for power. At first, Torkel Knutsson managed to control the younger brothers, to keep power in the group around the king. at one point even forcing Erik and Valdemar to flee to Norway. While in Norway, Erik married a daughter of the king and established an independent base of power in the Norwegian-Swedish border provinces. Torkel Knutsson managed to force the brothers to recognize Birger as king and to sign a pledge to not have an independent foreign policy. Eventually, though, the brothers would stop fighting enough to work together to remove the marshal from power, and in 1306, King Birger had Torkel Knutsson executed. A period of calm between the brothers now commenced. At the end of September 1306, the younger brothers were together at a wedding in Bjälbo, the founding estate of the house. After the wedding, the brothers came to visit King Birger at his estate in Håtuna. The king received them warmly, and they feasted together through the night. At some point the mood changed, and Erik and Valdemar and their men overpowered the king and took him captured. Crucially though, the king's son Magnus was rescued and sent to Denmark. With this, Erik now became the de facto ruler of Sweden. But with his connection to and power base also in Norway, he now became a thorn in the eye of the Danish king, who invaded Sweden. When the king of Norway also took the side of the Danes, the pressure on Erik and Valdemar became too great, and they were forced to release King Birger after 2 years in captivity. The country was now effectively divided into 3 separate realms, ruled by each of the brothers. After this, 10 years went by without any infighting. During a trip in the autumn of 1317, the youngest brother Valdemar passed through Birger's territory and stayed as a guest of his brother the king. Valdemar was surprised how warmly he was received and noted that the king seemed to have put their history behind them. When Birger then invited him and Erik to celebrate Christmas together, he took it on himself to convince his brother that it was a good idea. When the dukes arrived for the Christmas celebrations, they were met by the king himself. Both he and the queen seemed to be in an excellent mood, and all squabbles seemed to have been forgotten. The king made jokes and seemed to be very happy. But at one point, the duke's retinues were suddenly told that they would be housed out in the city, with the explanation that it was too crowded inside the castle. Then, when the last of the duke's men had left, the castle gates were closed and locked. The party went on as before, but then suddenly, a company of the king's crossbowmen surprised and captured Erik and Valdemar, who were put into the prison dungeon. According to legend, Birger then told his brothers, "Do you remember the Håtuna Games? I remember them all too well. This one is not likely to be any better." Erik and Valdemar understood that they were not likely to be spared by their brother, and made sure to write down their wills while in the prison cell. These testaments actually survives, and are now kept in a museum. But Birger had ultimately overplayed his hand. When news got out about their imprisonment, the supporters of the dukes rose up in a civil war that ultimately toppled the king. When he finally realized he had lost the fight, Birger took the key to the prison cell and went up to the walls of Nyköping Castle and then threw it into the river. So, do you still remember the key we opened the video with? Could this be the same key? It is very possible, but we will likely never know.